Good morning, Grid Connections listeners. This week we have our favorite panel of returning guests, John McElroy from Autoline Network, Matt Teske of Chargeway, and Loren McDonald of EV Adoption. In this episode, we discuss the past quarter's EV sales along with examining the trends and challenges facing the larger automotive industry. EVs might not be the only ones having some issues with sales, it turns out. Our panel discusses the pros and cons of plug-in hybrids versus fully electric vehicles as well, offering insights that every electric vehicle enthusiast will find valuable. We then turn our attention to the current state of electric vehicle charging, exploring the realities of road tripping in an EV today. Additionally, we discuss the status of NEVI funding and its potential to significantly enhance charging infrastructure across the United States. Don't miss this episode packed with expert opinions and thought-provoking discussions. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with at least one other listener who you think would appreciate it as well. And don't forget to leave a positive review on our podcast page. Your feedback helps us grow and bring you even more fantastic content. With that, enjoy. I'm joined today by our favorite panel. We got Matt Teske of Chargeway, John McElroy of Autoline Network, and we also have Mr. Loren McDonald of EV Adoption. Thank you, gentlemen, for being back on the show today.
Thanks.
It's great to be back in such awesome company.
Yeah, agreed.
Same here.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Just real briefly, I think everyone's pretty familiar with all three of you now, but just in case, I'm just going to pick one of you at random, just looking at my screen. If each of you could just give a quick background, that'd be great. So Matt, why don't you kick it off?
Definitely, yeah. I'm Matt Teske. I'm the founder and CEO of Chargeway, and Chargeway is a software and mobile app for finding and locating EV charging stations and planning road trips. And we have a system that makes it super easy for everyone. So give the Chargeway app a download.
Thank you so much, Matt. John, what about you next?
Yeah, I'm the president of Blue Sky Productions. We have a bunch of products that we put out under the Autoline brand, everything and anything to do with the automotive industry.
And finally, but not least, Loren, why don't you take us home?
Yeah, hi, Loren McDonald, CEO of EV Adoption. We're a EV charging data analysis firm. So we track everything from, how many chargers are going into the ground to like incentive programs like the NEVI program that many people might be familiar with, utility incentives, EV sales. We do a lot of forecasts, things like that. So if it's EV or EV charging data, we're probably tracking it.
And I think we've got a few different topics that are always fan favorites to go over today, ranging from just the current EV market to kind of EV charging in North America. But let's kind of kick it off with a focus on, I think, not even just EV sales, but automotive sales. John, I've been kind of watching some of the stuff you've been covering this week with a lot of the North American automakers about how this past quarter, Q2, went for them in 2024. And I think there's been such a strong narrative, and maybe not the automotive news realm, but just the media in general, that electric vehicles and a lot of these things aren't doing well. But from what we're seeing from this past quarter, it might be the automotive industry in general has definitely kind of been struggling a little bit about, this year. So I think it'd be great just to kind of get your take and thoughts on what you've seen recently, and we'll go from there.
Sure thing. Everyone thought 2024 was going to be pretty good. They thought, okay, we got COVID behind us, the chip shortage behind us. Now we're going to go back to a quote unquote normal year. And it hasn't materialized. I think there's a couple of things going on. Number one, interest rates. Holy moly. Car prices have been super high. They've moderated a little bit, but now with interest rates so high, people are having a hard time getting a loan, or they don't want to pay the money. It's really expensive. Plus, last month, we had a cyber attack on this company called CDK that does DMS, dealer management systems, and thousands and thousands and thousands of dealers all across the country use CDK software to run their business. Well, guess what? It crapped out. I mean, they literally went back to pen and paper in a lot of cases to try to process sales. So, the latest sales figures for June, for example, last month, a little bit uncertain as to how things are going because we don't know how much CDK disrupted what was going on. But I will say this, Chase, even though overall sales are soft, the EV segment's outperforming the market. I mean, right. It's one of the few bright spots, although with the latest registration numbers, doesn't look like Tesla is hauling the water anymore. It seems to be the legacy automakers that have picked up the pace here. because in point of fact, we've seen Tesla sales go down. And so, are we at this poignant moment in the market where, here we've seen Tesla created this segment. I mean, let's get real. But now it looks like the legacies are starting to make their weight felt.
John, I have a question for you on the CDK thing. Do you think there's going to be a delayed reporting? In other words, like might July and August actually be higher than they would have been because of the delay in, from moving from the paper back to, to technology?
I think there will be. In fact, on our Autoline After Hours program yesterday, we had the new VP of sales from Honda on the show. And he was saying essentially that, Loren, that, some people couldn't get the car they wanted. So there's a little bit of pent up demand there. And other orders couldn't be processed. So it should look better.
Yep. I would say on the sales side of it, I think the elephant in the room of it is with the Tesla conversation is Tesla has they're going to have to contend with how their CEO is having an impact on their brand image and people's interest in their products. It's rampant on. I mean, I've had conversations personally with people, but you hear people chattering about it on a lot of different social platforms about how people are flat out saying, "I will not buy a Tesla because of Elon."
Matt, think about it. His biggest market in the world is California. and he's been trashing the state, saying, I'm moving Tesla. I already moved Tesla out. Now I'm going to get SpaceX out. I'm going to move Neuralink out. The hell with that state, essentially. It's the old city, feds to New York City, drop dead. This is Tesla to California, drop dead. And I think it's been foolish for him to take that kind of stance. I mean, as an individual, fine. But as the CEO of a car company, that's a big mistake. And the other thing I keep harping on, it's time for Tesla to update its styling. The S and X have not changed in a decade. The 3 and the Y are 5 years old or something. I know I get lots of blowback from the Tesla fans saying, "Oh, you're ignoring over-the-air updates. You're ignoring the Highland refresh on the Model 3 and blah, 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 blah." And I'm telling you, the auto industry is a fashion industry.
Oh, yeah.
The companies with the freshest designs are the ones that make market share grow. Yeah. And this is why, big department stores in big cities change their window displays every couple of months, because otherwise you get used to it, you don't even notice it.
Yeah, no, I think it's amazing the S and the X have had the length they've had in sales. I mean, it's and they've done some gloss here and there. The interiors are refreshed a tad, But I think the Model 3 Highland, as an example, I think is what each of these Y, X, and S all need the same type of genuine refresh. Yeah. And so if they can do that on the Y, the X, and the S, as they did with the 3, I think it'll help. But it doesn't change the fact that I think that the S and the X, to your point, John, I mean, they are just dated products now, and you can only squeeze the over-the-air update benefit for so long before, to your point, it is, again, automotive industry the aesthetic there is so important to people. And if you feel like you're buying a product from 2012, you can only say so much about the software before you're kind of like, but,
I do agree with you on that, John. I do have a question for you, because I feel like you're totally right that the styling hasn't changed. I think there are usually improvements, especially exterior stuff like we saw recently with the Model 3. But you know what it really reminds me of is like Porsche, like devout Porsche 911 buyers. Like, I cannot tell the difference between one year from the next, and someone will say, "Oh, you see the light they have this different type of LED versus that LED," and the average person has no idea. And it does seem like, good or bad, there is a very similar mentality and following to a lot of the people who buy into the Tesla thing. And do you think that there is some element to that, like almost kind of the mindset, and just like they have that core group of followers that have really followed that? Or do you really think at the scale that the 3 and Y are at, especially, they need to be changing it more? Or is there some sort of other way that they can kind of get that engagement without the exterior refresh, like you're seeing with maybe Hyundai and some of the other EV cars that, from like kind of the fashion styling that you're talking about, have been seeing a lot of success?
Yeah, look, when Tesla was the only game in town, so to speak, the only EV game in town, it could do whatever it wants. But now it's facing some pretty toughening competition. And when you bring up Porsche, that's a very small group,
Totally,
the cognoscenti,
totally.
they're hyper aware, kind of like Tesla owners.
But that's kind of what I'm saying. Yeah, that group
right.
that they've, yeah.
But if you're going after the mass market, and Musk has talked about making 20 million cars a year, which I never believed anyway, and I don't think he's ever going to get anywhere close to that. But if you're going to the mass market, the general American buyer, when they buy a new car, they want everyone to know, I got a new one. I got the latest stuff. I mean, we all deny that, we're not that egocentric, but guess what? When you buy a new car, man, it feels so good. And you want everybody to know. And when you buy a 2024 Model 3 that looks like a 2019 Model 3, people don't know. Now, it depends. It's very regional. So if you're out in California where you see Teslas everywhere, people can't tell, are you in a new one or an old one or what? Out here in the Midwest where I'm at, just outside Detroit, maybe not so much the 3 and the Y, but the S and X, you don't see them very often. So they still look like fresh designs. But in places where they've been selling well, people are starting to look at some of the other alternatives.
Yeah, John, I wanted to talk about that because I agree with both you and Matt that from what I see it, there's sort of like 4 main things that are sort of slowing the Tesla sales in the US. And one is the Musk effect, right? I mean, I hear that from a lot of people. And think about it, even if it's only a couple of percent, 5% of potential buyers, like, of what, 700,000 in sales that Tesla did in the 3 and the Y last year, whatever. What's that math? That's
35,000 cars.
Yeah, so I did. Right? Sorry, I have been looking up the numbers. So like just through the first of this year, Tesla has sold globally 831,000 vehicles. Then it goes down to BYD at about 726,000, and then the next closest is a pretty big jump down to Volkswagen Group at 316,000. So
yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of
trying to bring
looking at the U.S. In other words, I think even if that's a small number of people who say I will not buy Musk issues, and I think actually the sub part of that, which is people like me and Matt, who are maybe multiple time Tesla owners, are like, not again, right? So like if you think about the couple of million people that own Teslas, a lot of them have decided like, I don't want another Tesla. So the next time around, and that's losing a big part of the market share, John. It's not just like the people that are thinking about an EV and a Tesla. That's a big effect. The second thing we talked about that I agree is just sort of the models are, need to be updated, but I also think they need a new model. Right. And I'm not including the Cybertruck.
I was about to say, Loren, what do you mean? There's a brand new Tesla model.
I literally was driving back about 20 minutes ago behind one, and that's definitely not its best angle.
I mean, and John, you could talk for an hour about this. Like, especially like in the East Coast, like what do people like? They like the Honda CRVs and the, and the Toyotas and the, like the smaller, crossovers and stuff like that. And the Y sort of filled that for a while, but now I think we need something smaller and cheaper than that, right?
Yeah.
Like, and where is it, right? I guess we're getting the robo taxi.
Well, that distraction piece is a big part of the conversation, right? Musk, I think we talked about it previously. Is he's lost interest in running Tesla, and the things that he is now interested in as a CEO it has nothing to do with product development, new refresh product, things like that. And, you can put that onto someone like Franz von Holhausen and be like, okay, like, what are you dreaming up and how can you influence Musk to be like, hey, we really got to, rethink some of this stuff. I just, that's going to be a tall hill to climb, I think, for where Musk is leading things.
Yeah. And John, I think that, the last thing they're sort of connected at the hip, which is where I live in Northern California in the suburbs. Literally, I can pull up to a stoplight, an intersection with 8 lanes, right? And every car can be a Model Y. Like I'm literally not exaggerating, right? And so they're boring out here. Like to your point, like you said, people deny this. If you ask people, when you buy a car, part of it is you want other people to know that, you're well off or whatever it is, right? A lot of the reasons we buy, people don't admit it, but they do, right? When you buy a Tesla now, you're not telling anybody anything anymore, right? Like it's not that different. You know, when we bought our first Tesla in 2016, it was like, ooh, you drive a Tesla.
No.
Now it's like, oh, you drive a Tesla, right? It's like it's boring, right? And so, and this sort of the second part of that is the competition, which you touched on, right? Like 4 or 5 years ago, there were 25 other EV models you could choose from, including plug-in hybrids or whatever. Now there's like 80.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and several years ago, if you wanted a luxury sedan, there was the Model S. There are now like 8 luxury sedans. You can get a Lucid, you can get a BMW, you can get a Mercedes, you can get a Audi, right? Like you can get a, whatever, go down the list, right? And so, they're being sort of niched to death, I think, also, right? And I did this analysis and article looking at the average sales per unit over the last couple of quarters, right? And it's basically roughly flat. It's like 5,000 to 6,000 sales per EV model per quarter, right? It's like it's not growing because like look at this last quarter. We had the Equinox, the Blazer, right? You got all these new models. A lot of those are people that maybe were going to buy the Mach-E or the Y, right? And so then they go over to the other one. So like as we get more of these models, it's really difficult for the sales to grow for any of those existing ones, including Tesla.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing is the typical car buying process, which is what do people, everything we've talked about, what do people know? Well, they don't want to buy the thing that everyone has. They do want to stand out a little bit different, which will only help these new models coming to market, Equinox, Blazer, go down the list.
Kia EV9, yeah.
I'm actually going to push back on that a little bit. And it's not like, I think everything you guys are saying is totally true, but in some ways for the EV, like first time buyer, I still get questions. I even had a question yesterday about guys like, should I get a Tesla? And I just asked him, like, do you want to get an electric car and not really have to think about it? He's like, yeah. I was like, okay.
Well, that's exactly it.
He's like, okay, I'm done. I'm in. I'll just get that.
That point, Chase, is most important. Yeah. Is that the buying experience that people are accustomed to, which is I just like that car. They haven't had to think about how the car functions for their day-to-day life. They've been buying based on the aesthetic. That we're seeing that now translate into the EV world, but the EV experience, as Chase, as you just pointed out, yeah, it's not apples to apples there. It's software, infrastructure, things of that nature. And for all the things you can point to Tesla about, or even give Elon grief, which he's earned. I mean, my wife and I talked about this. We both drive Teslas, and we're both kind of like, yeah, but what would we opt for if we still wanted to have an electric car? And because of the knowledge we have, the answer is, yeah, I'm just going to get the sticker for my trunk that says bought it before he was a jerk. I mean, like, honestly, like, because it's like, I know that if we opted to switch to another electric car, we'd be giving up things like how well the software works and how well the infrastructure works. And as much as I can say, like, yeah, I mean, I got plenty of friends that still work at Tesla, and they still take a lot of pride in their work. So it's like, yes, it is about the CEO to a point. There are really smart engineers and hardworking people there that make the company function. But if the board or somebody does not get Elon to tamp down on what he's been doing as it relates to the image of Tesla being tied to him, yeah, they are in trouble. And then that concerns me, that people's first time EV experience, because they say no to Tesla and they buy another EV that has deficiencies in software and infrastructure, they're going to have a potentially less positive experience for those factors. And it might actually damage people's first impression of EVs because they're just thinking how they always do, which is like emotionally and aesthetically. It's like, I don't like Elon, I'm going to buy that EV instead. I think we do run the risk of that for EVs in general, and Musk clearly doesn't care about that anymore. Like, the mission to him, woohoo, gone. He doesn't care. So that concerns me. So
it concerns me too.
Ask you, John.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, why don't you say what you were going to
say?
No,
I was just going to say it concerns me too, Matt. I want to see Tesla succeed. I think it's a great story, and I've come from full skeptic to I drank the Kool-Aid. But look, they had a disastrous second quarter. I mean, their operating profit was down almost 40%. Yeah. That should shake the board up.
Yeah.
And the success behind Tesla has been this 50% per year growth. It's over. That growth is over. This is why Elon has pivoted to talking about Optimus robots and AI and robo-taxis, because he's got to do something to keep the faithful, there with the stock price.
Yeah.
But Look, Franz, you brought his name up. He's a great designer. I'll bet he's got sketches all over his studio of what they want to do with all the models.
Yeah.
Time to let them rip loose and go for it.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Yeah.
What,
And
you don't think that Tesla tequila is like a growth market opportunity, John?
Probably high margin.
there you go.
Yeah.
It probably is.
Yeah, no, I think until they get Elon in line in some way, to your point, John, the numbers when those came out, I think everybody just kind of had their like, oh my god moment about someone actually did the math on it and broke it down. They said if we were to do this by the numbers, this stock should be at like $8 a share.
And it's up the last couple of days.
Yeah.
Well,
Right?
it is the best.
Now it's back up.
It's the best hype stock for the last 10, 15, 20 years, arguably, right? I mean, and it is that. I think the promise of what Tesla offered for the last 15, 20 years was what people were buying into. And John, to your point, now he's just like, okay, how can I keep the faithful alive and excited about how we're a tech company doing this crazy fun stuff? It's like, yeah, but we also need you bring the lunch pail to work type CEO on this is still a car company in so many ways, not this just like cornucopia of all these things. It's like you guys still do make cars. And if you don't get that right, you're going to just, all the goodwill that you've gotten from people is just going to just flounder over the years. And yeah, I mean, without Franz getting let loose, like you said, John, or maybe it was Loren, it's just like, yeah, without that, uh-oh.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting because like their last stock or investor relations that they did earlier this week, it was clear like all their margin was coming from their energy storage grid backup stuff.
Yeah.
Which it's great they have that, I guess. But it was just, it kind of reminded me of what we've seen for a while. Definitely different, but like the legacy automakers, how they're trying to take all their profits from one area and try to cover some of the challenges they've had with the EV market. Obviously, Tesla's kind of done a pretty big 180 because that used to be their strength, was kind of the margins they had. But one thing that I did kind of want to ask you about, John, because this was covered, I think, in the news like a month or so ago, and you guys had mentioned it, was like, I believe it was like 47% of people who were in an EV.
Oh.
Then
The McKinsey study.
Yeah. And I was just kind of curious if you had heard any more about that, or like what your thoughts are with why, I guess clearly Matt and Loren, you have some ideas too. Not necessarily I agree with it, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on what has been the issue with that struggle as to why, just for anyone listening who's not familiar, I believe it was like 47% allegedly due to this globally. Thanks. Due to the survey was saying that when someone went to an EV, then they went back and they went to a combustion vehicle after that.
Yeah, I haven't dived into the details of that survey. It sounds like clickbait to me, to be honest.
I agree, but
I'll have to look more into it, Chase. But I didn't get into the details of that.
Yeah. So Chase and Matt and I were on a string with John Volker, the infamous EV analyst, almost as famous as John McElroy, but he actually had some back and forth with McKinsey on that. Got a bunch of questions answered, including some from me and Matt. But they're defending it. But there are 10 other studies out there that have completely different numbers on that. So it's like pick which survey you fits your narrative and go with it. I just find it hard to believe that half of the people that buy an EV go back to a gas car. You just don't see it, right? Some percent, yes. And there's an old study from a few years ago that UC Davis did that's one of my favorite on this topic. It was kind of old. There was like the early Nissan Leafs and the Fiat 500e in it, right? So that gives you a sense of how old it is. But what they found was like literally almost nobody that bought a Tesla went back to an ICE vehicle. And the people that went from an EV back to ICE were apartment dwellers, or they were driving an EV that had 90 miles of range, or a combination of both, right? In other words, it all comes back to Matt Teske. It all comes back to charging. It all comes back to the charging experience, right? That the people who say an EV is not for me do not have convenient access to charging, a longer range EV. They rely on shitty public charging, like whatever it is. It's not the car, it's the charging experience is why they go back. That's what it all boils down to. And that takes us back to Tesla. Why people who don't want to buy a product from Elon still buy another Tesla, right? Because it's the best charging experience, software buying experience, etc. So
I couldn't have said better myself, Loren. I mean, I agree with all that. It's and so to the point of where do these studies come from? Who are the target demographics? What it's like to everything you just said. It's like they got to dig a little deeper. Which EV did you have, and where do you live?
Yeah,
another thing.
Right, it was a pretty small survey group too, but it was just something that I remember had been in the news around EV sales that we hadn't talked about since our last meeting.
And I'm sure there was some truth to part of it, but it just like.
It was a glaring difference from most of the other studies we see.
Yeah, exactly. JD Power has followed this too, and they're very careful. I think maybe more careful than McKinsey's been in its numbers, because if I remember right, and I admit I didn't read the whole survey, they were looking at trade-ins on new cars, and they were seeing all these electrics and drawing a conclusion from that. And what the JD Power people have said is, hey, wait a minute, you don't know if they're really getting rid of an EV because they don't like it. Maybe they had 2 EVs in their household, and they thought, you know what, we should have an ICE vehicle too, so let's trade that in. So I think there's a lot more study that's got to go into this, but I just don't buy the numbers that they're giving up on EVs.
Yeah, I mean, McKinsey did get the fentanyl market right. They understood that was a big market, so we know they get some things right.
Oh man.
That's a different podcast altogether.
Yeah, that was a different podcast. Yeah,
but it is Friday, so who knows? Maybe we're sliding into our weekend a little early, I guess, today. I guess I realize we've already talked for about almost 30 minutes on this, but I'm just kind of curious, talking about EV sales. Obviously, Tesla's been a big part of what we're talking about already. Let's change it a little bit. What do you think? Obviously, we're starting to see some kind of better actually options come to the market from other automakers in multiple kind of segments for the industry. What do you think that either the tradition, essentially, what do you think anyone other than Tesla really needs to be doing right now to kind of keep that momentum going, to kind of put the focus back on the narrative that overall EV sales are growing?
Can I just throw out one last sort of numbers thing? So sorry.
Yes, go for it.
So I looked at 57 BEVs over the last year and a half, quarterly sales, and they were up 30% in Q2 over Q1 of 2023. But if you take out the new models, so all the models that were introduced since then, is only up 14.8%. Right. So basically, the models that have been around for a year and a half growing just a little bit. And, so it's the existing market is growing a little bit, and the new market is sort of growing a little bit, but still it's not adding up to the big numbers. And I think, and John could talk to this, like 5-6 years ago when EV sales were a couple 100,000, and the next year they went to double that, right? Like we had 80% growth, woohoo, 100% growth or whatever it is. Well, we're at like, including plug-in hybrids, we're like 1.4 or whatever it is, and so now when you get a couple 100,000 growth, it's like 20% or whatever the math is, right? It's like, and so I think, it's just math, and this idea that we were going to continue to see 100% growth just ignores, people's ability to use Excel and understand that, Apple years ago stopped having 100% year over year sales on the iPhone, right? Because they were selling 50 million a year or whatever it was, right? They weren't going to sell 100 million the next year. If they sold another million, that was huge. And I think we're entering that part with EVs. At any rate, I didn't mean to get off, but I think it's just an important point to understand this narrative that all the automakers are going, oh my God, EV sales aren't growing like we thought. Well, yeah, did you think they were going to grow 100% every year for the rest of life? No.
Maybe not that, but I think some of them, well, and we keep hearing more too about like our projections. Yeah, we're not going to do 1 million in 2025. We're pulling back on that, or we're going to hold out on switching that factory to pure electrics. We're actually going to build more trucks at that factory again still. Yeah. So we are seeing that happening, and to a certain extent, again, I think that some of this was a lack of understanding of what they were building, what the ecosystem they needed to build. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, if we build cars with big batteries in them and people are going to buy them like Teslas, right? Well, geez, let's do that. And it's like, yeah, okay. But in the legacy world, it's like you have to contend with, did you get the software right? Where's the infrastructure? How is your dealer network going to support that and actually make it really a good experience for people? There was a lot of pieces that they just kind of did what they've done for years, which is we produce the vehicle, we'll just put it into the sales system that we have, and we've got some marketing around it. And look what EVs are doing. I mean, not to oversimplify it, but I think to an extent, there was so much going on to get the engineering done just to get these products to market, with still having gaps in understanding of what they're bringing to market, right? And we've seen that play out with these kind of reactive moments of, we need to change strategy or whatever it might look like. So to your point, Lauren, I don't think they thought it was going to be like, we're going to sell 100,000 of these or a million of these out of the gate. But to an extent, I just don't think they fundamentally understood a lot of the different little support pieces that had to be there to make their growth be what they anticipated. And so we're now seeing that backtracking, and add to that the political year that we're in, that's just all kinds of fun. It's just like, how are they reacting to those moments too? So there's a lot of things that come into play with that. So
yeah, and I think and this is like going to be the third topic, so I don't want to get us out of order here, Chase. But I think an exclamation point to what you just said, Matt, is the fact that a year ago, 7 automakers got together and announced Iona, the new charging network. Right? It took them 10 years to figure out what Tesla figured out in 2012. Right.
Right.
I was literally driving my car yesterday. I mean, I have a 2018 Model 3, and I was driving it, and it did cross my mind that I was like, yeah, this coming fall, I will have had this car for 6 years. And I'm like, okay, 6 years. Like, what's happened since I bought this car? And new products have come to market and things have been, growing, which is true. But then if you compare the apples to apples game, and John, it made me think of, like the videos you've done about what's happening in the Chinese market. And I thought, yeah, there's just a dragging of feet still happening domestically on a lot of what they could be doing to compete. It really just, it struck me. Because I was like, yeah, this thing is still better than most brand new EVs you can buy from other brands today. And it's 6 years old. That's crazy.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned the 6-year thing, because I didn't really realize this. Earlier this week, I'd had my Model Y for 2 years. And the only reason I know that officially is I got a push notification, and it said a message from Tesla. I was like, okay, I figured it might have been a service thing or something. And it says, congrats on owning your car for 2 years. And then it had this whole survey of different things they could be doing, recommendations. And it's one of those just really surprising. It's just a completely different approach to it that I thought was pretty fascinating, with kind of once again, just the user experience and asking for feedback, saying, and just looking, they had highlights of how I'd use the car and all this stuff. And
really,
I don't know if it's more like a generational interest thing, but especially from someone who's kind of worked in the software and tech side, you're like, of course Tesla would be the one to do this, but you would see more of the Rivians and the Lucids of the world to kind of take that approach. But it is just a really fascinating
Chase,
take on it.
This is not true. Tesla does not do marketing.
What do you mean?
Okay, sorry. I have to translate. So for years, the Tesla fanboys have been proud of the fact that all the other automakers spend all this money on advertising and everything like that, and Tesla doesn't spend any money on marketing. When in fact, because I've met with people on the marketing team before and stuff, they do email marketing. They're now doing Google AdWords. Right. They have hundreds of stores. That's marketing, right? They have superchargers. That's marketing, right? It's brand, etc. So anyway, I was teasing.
I just it just was something that popped in my head, because it was such a crazy thing to think, my car is telling me I've owned it for 2 years, as and I just thought that was just such a wild experience, especially if you lease the vehicle. It's almost like, oh, it's been 2 years. Well, you got a year to go. And then you could start some sort of drip campaign to remind them at the end of that third year of the lease, hey, we got this hot deal. I don't know. It was just such an interesting, let's put it this way. My Subaru never told me how long I had it. My Land Rover from the 80s does not tell me how long I've had it. And then it doesn't ask me, how can I make your life better, Chase?
Well,
which
to me, this
is such a funny experience.
This really defines the difference between that, that vertically integrated ecosystem compared to a dealer ecosystem, right?
Oh, for sure.
The legacies are like, that's the dealer's job to do that outreach and hit people up on those comments and thoughts. That's we don't do that. Whereas Tesla, again, I've never seen email like that from Tesla, but I think it's cool they're doing it. But that's just it speaks to their engagement with their customers in a way that is different from legacy. Lesson to be learned from that, possibly, yeah. But yeah, I think that's the thing is we're still in that the legacy mindset of pivoting from things that they have known to how can they think differently in these processes. And yeah, we're still in the throes of how that will all play out. So
now I'll be curious if I'm sure you'll probably get one. It was just a push notification to my phone. So I definitely, as someone kind of also in the marketing tech background, I'm curious to see what you think of it when you get one. But John, I think this will probably be the last of it. Where do you think that you're hearing as far as like in Detroit, as far as with the legacy OEMs? Is this everything that we're kind of babbling about aligning with some of the stuff you're hearing from the messaging, as well as the repositioning of selling EVs, or how they're trying to approach them as a product to the end customer?
Look, they got their hair on fire, and it's not just Detroit. It's Stuttgart, it's Tokyo, it's they've got this transition to EVs to make, and now they found out, you just don't put batteries in electric motors. You got to do software-defined vehicles. You got to go to zonal architecture. You've got to develop this with digital twins. It's like, holy crap, we don't know how to do any of that stuff. And you've seen them try to do things on their own and fail miserably. Look at Volkswagen with Cariad. I mean, it fell flat on its face twice, and they ran to Rivian and paid them $5 billion to get their zonal architecture after they spent, I don't know, at least that much money or more trying to get Cariad going. And now they've got the Chinese breathing down their necks with maybe a 35% cost advantage. Maybe they're coming into Mexico and backdoor the tariffs that way. So they're desperately worried. They know that what they've got. Well, let me make some statements here. Ford knows what it's got right now was a rush to market job, slap stuff together as fast as we can. We got the Lightning, we got the Mach-E, we got the E-Transit. They know their next generation vehicle is not going to be out until about 2027. That's when they'll start to get competitive. GM, I'm not going to say bullish on, but I'm starting to admire their stick to their strategy. They clearly overinvested like Ford did too. They were exuberant, and going back, Matt and Loren, to some of the earlier discussion, they were misled by the market. Remember, Tesla got 1.5 million or reservations, deposits for the Cybertruck, fully refundable. People went, holy crap, look at that. Who's ever seen that? Ford got 200,000 deposits for the Lightning. Where are those people? GM got, I don't know if they ever really announced the numbers, but they said, look, we're getting strong orders for the electric Silverado, Cadillac Lyriq, and whatnot. But having said that, GM is probably going to end up this year in the United States selling somewhere between 200 and 250,000 EVs. They claim that once they break the 200,000 barrier, they're going to start to have a variable profit on those EVs. Honda's part of that mix too. The Prologue is just hitting the market. They claim within a 12-month period, they're going to sell 40,000 of those things. So it's starting to happen. But, if it wasn't for that irrational exuberance 4 years ago where they went, we need all these plants, we need all this capacity. If they had been a little bit more conservative, they'd look a whole lot smarter right now. And that's why you're seeing them either delay plants opening or moving ICE vehicles into them because they can clearly make way more EVs than there is demand for right now.
Yeah, John, I think Q4 is going to be fascinating this year, right? Because you've got, the Equinox and the Blazer, they're starting to scale up production and stuff. And if those things are hits, from an EV sales perspective, if they're selling, 6, 8, 10,000 a quarter of those, or, like that's going to be like really pretty solid. But if they're only selling 3,000 or 4,000 a quarter or something like that, that's going to be concerning, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And what does that Honda Prologue do, right? And then the Acura version. So we've got these new models that are either coming out or just sort of scaling up, and I think that's going to be like the real litmus test of where this market is at, is if some of these new models that are like solid models, they speak to the middle America, right? I mean, these are Chevy buyers, right? It's like, will they actually buy them? That's going to be fascinating. Or do they buy them for like 1 or 2 quarters and then it like plateaus?
That's what I was about to say. Yeah, like is it full circle on our conversation? Is it the fresh new car in town and people jump out and grab at them, and then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, but what was that interest? They do have some pent up demand from people that have been interested in some of these new models from EV people in the EV community that have been on lists for Equinox and Blazer, etc. Blazer had that issue from the outset from the software side, looks to be resolved. Hopefully Equinox doesn't have the same types of issues. I think that I think it can, again, full circle to our conversation, people are still hungry for new options in EVs, especially because of what we're seeing with what we talked about with Tesla earlier, which is this lightning rod CEO that's again doing damage to the brand and the product, combined with the aging product. Everybody's looking around going, well, what else is on the market? So the timing actually is really good for some of these things that are coming from like GM. So, right. But I think exactly what you said, Loren, is like, yeah, but how is there longevity to that? Or is it going to be, it's just new hotness on the market, and then a quarter or two later, it's like, womp, womp,
Look, the real question too is who gets elected in November? And if Trump gets reelected and tries to
election year?
Yeah.
I haven't heard anything about that.
I haven't noticed.
It's only July. We'll see if it's still happening in November.
We've seen it happen in China where they reduced incentives for EVs and sales softened. We're seeing it happen in Germany where sales are actually going down. I mean, it's not the growth rate slowing down, actual sales going down because the Germans yanked the incentives on it. So that's a real danger. And that's why I fully expect the auto industry, dealers, the unions to say, hey, wait a minute, Trump, if he gets elected, don't financially damage these companies, because that's what you're going to do if you yank all this stuff out from under them.
Yeah. Yep. And what's interesting, the comments that are made on the political side of it, when Elon was all gung-ho talking politics for like the last month on Twitter, for example, sorry, X. I just can't bring myself to call it X. It just sounds ridiculous. But you noticed how even his commentary around when he was asked during the earnings call, he said, well, frankly, it's not really going to hurt us much. I mean, it might hurt other people, but it's not going to hurt us much. And I was thinking, wow, that's again, so far from the original mission of what he said he was trying to accomplish with this company. But no, I think John, you're right. I think if that does go to the wayside, then even how they did clarify and clean up how that was working as it related to what vehicles were eligible. We stand to see, again, I don't think it's going to drop off, but I mean, we are seeing this. The growth curve is not this hockey stick. It's more realistic in the realm of, we are talking about $50,000, $60,000 products here right. To Lauren's point, where's the $20,000, $30,000 one legitimately that people can actually afford? Because when I was flying home from a recent trip, I was at the airport. I went to buy a McDonald's hash brown. It was $3.59 for a hash brown from McDonald's. And I thought, man, if this is pissing me off, I can only imagine how people feel when they're like, how much is that new car? Yeah, forget it. It's just like, good Lord. So, yeah.
Yeah, I know
to that, Matt, the average age of cars is going up like
crazy.
Like 0.6 of a year, like half a year or 9 months, like every year now.
Yeah.
Right. In a couple of years, we're going to be the average age of cars is like 20 years old, right? Because think about it. Cars are made so much better now than they were 30, 40 years ago that, a 20-year-old Toyota Camry is still a good car, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I get that argument from friends all the time who'll say, hey, I love the idea about going electric, but I have to be perfectly honest with you. Like, my car's paid off and it runs well still. I'm not having problems. So, I mean, maybe for my next one. So, yeah, to how do we replace this aging fleet? Well, if the aging fleet is still operating the way that people and people are getting pinched at the wallet, they're kind of like, unless that's a $20,000 EV that really makes it so like, unmistakable I should do it. Maybe they'll wait for it, but then it's like, what do they buy a used aged EV that has technology from 2018 that wasn't a Tesla, or 2020 that wasn't a Tesla? Then all of a sudden it's like, what are they buying? It's like, oh, there's a software gremlin in that legacy OEM vehicle you're looking at. And that's the thing, is people are discovering this stuff in real time. we just don't have an educated buying market that understands what they're getting into. They just approach it like they always have. So we're going to have so many of these just kind of start and stop moments as it relates to how people are responding to what they're getting, simply by sake of, is it new or old, or what's the price? So.
Well, I think one of the other things that I've found really interesting, well, kind of working with some dealerships lately, is kind of going through the political side of it, is if those all go away as far as the incentives, I think that may help with the sales process, because I recently had an experience where they just were not interested in dealing with like, well, it qualifies for $3,750, this qualifies for that, or if you lease it, then it's $7,500, and they just seem to feel like, and kind of understandably, that it overcomplify the already complicated sales process of selling an EV over a combustion vehicle. But I also say, like, with the used market, that is such a huge market compared to the new vehicle market that it'll only slow down that adoption rate if there's less EV new car sales, in addition to all the concerns you've kind of brought up about what the quality of those are, and concerns around battery degradation and other things for some of these EVs that are newer to the market versus like the decade Tesla's already had for a lot of their products.
Yeah, this is a weird time to be alive in the world of automotive. I mean, it's volatile. And again, week to week, day to day. I mean, we've discussed this in the past. I try to do my best to just not respond to the daily news and really take a step back, look at the parade view of the conversation, say, okay, how does this impact the long term here? Or is this just like a fly by night, news hit? And
right.
Gartner Research does this thing that they call the hype cycle, that they've developed. And it's sort of a bell curve kind of a thing, chart. And it shows out, a new technology comes out and it's sort of there. And then all of a sudden it catches fire and man, it takes off. And that's what we saw with EVs over the last couple of years. The hype got way out in front of the reality. And then for the Gartner hype cycle, things collapse. Everybody thinks it's garbage. It's never going to happen. And that's where we're at, right, I think, kind of right now, at least with the general public, that, EVs are stupid. It's not going to happen. And it's from there that you see slow but steady growth. And that's what I expect to see. I've been saying this for a number of years. My own personal opinion is somewhere in the 2027, 2028 timeframe, we're really going to see EV sales take off in the United States.
Well, everything you just said on John, I think is 100% accurate. And that's what we talked about at the beginning of the year. It's like when I was, whatever the projection I had, Chase, you said, it was like, oh, the hype train's going to come off the rails, or whatever I said. I wasn't as eloquent about it as John just was. But I think that part of it is just we've had so much hype around it. And name the topic, we have hype around on a 24-hour basis, and people just need practical information around, is it real, is it not? And so we're weeding through a lot of the BS right now, which I think is a good thing. So.
Well, I guess that's an interesting segue real quickly. I know I'd put it as one of the bigger things to talk about, but I don't think there's as much. It was kind of EVs versus hybrids. And I think in the auto industry and among us, people talk about hybrids and are excited about it. Talking to mainstream people, I don't think they really care. Outside of like how you said it, John, that they shouldn't be talking that it's a hybrid. They should just educate people and say it gets 50 miles a gallon. The only people I have talked to, as far as like buying demographic, and I'm curious for everyone else's thought, that are kind of bought in and think hybrids are interesting, are like traditional Ram truck buyers. They're like, okay, that kind of makes sense. And they're very anti-EV usually. And I realize there's a lot of generalizations I'm using, but that's like the only part of the market where I've heard any sort of interesting enthusiasm for hybrids. And I'm curious if that's something that you guys have been seeing as well, because I think overall, especially with a lot of other more general consumers, I think the idea of an EV makes a lot of sense to them. It's if it can work with their life and it's not a big change to make that adoption. And so I'm kind of curious on your thoughts if hybrids are kind of, I feel like people just don't have the enthusiasm that there was for them in talking about these discussions like there was even a year ago.
Well, look, sales of hybrids have taken off. I mean, if you're an automaker with a strong hybrid portfolio, you're sitting pretty. Toyota, Honda, Ford, the Hyundai Kia group, their hybrid sales are up dramatically. And what's so funny to me is the same crowd that's bashing EVs, saying they're not really good for the environment, don't make any sense, are the exact same people who were bashing hybrids 15 years ago. They hated hybrids. They hated that thing. But now, hey, hybrid's got an internal combustion engine in it. All right, that's what I want. That's good. And, they keep talking about electrics being shoved down their throat. They don't want the government telling them what to buy. Well, I don't know anyone who's telling you what you have to go out and buy. But that's become this narrative amongst the anti-EV crowd. And for whatever reason, we know the reason. They're embracing hybrids because hybrids got an internal combustion engine in them.
So, just to put some numbers on this, right? So, the industry and the media tend to talk about EV sales share, the percentage of, new vehicles purchased each year that are EVs, BEVs, and plug-in hybrids, or one of those. To me, the more fascinating number is the VIO numbers, right? The vehicles in operation, and looking at that. And there are now about 295 million vehicles on the road in the US. And, like 6.5 million of those are BEVs and plug-in hybrids, somewhere in there. I don't have it memorized. So we've now reached about 1.6%. by my latest VIO forecast, the vehicles on the road have a plug, right? The point is, it's going to take us to like 2060, 2065 or whatever to get rid of those 290 million ICE vehicles. Because just like we said, they're lasting 20, 30, 40 years now. And they're still good cars oftentimes, right? So the point is that while everybody talks about, BEVs, we got to get everybody in a full electric vehicle. It's going to take decades to get BEVs to the point where they work for everybody, they're affordable, all that kind of stuff. So our goal is not 100% BEVs, right? Isn't our goal to reduce carbon emissions and pollution? And so if we can get somebody out of a truck that's getting 16 miles to a gallon into one that's getting 25 miles to a gallon, like we're cutting carbon emissions by 30, 40% or 50% or whatever. And so I'm a big fan of hybrids because it's reality.
Yeah.
Right? Like if 90%, 92% of the US market buying a new car this year don't buy a BEV, right? Would we rather have them in a hybrid that gets 35, 40 miles per gallon instead of one that gets 20 miles per gallon? It's just like common sense, isn't it? Like, I don't get why anybody would be against hybrids because they're perfectionists.
We're talking about long-standing brand recognition of what took 20 years. Yeah. It's taken 20 plus years for people to go from, saying, South Park made a really hilarious episode about people with their Priuses, right? It's taken that long to understand the psychology of what people were having against that. And it's again, that lily pad car kind of concept, right? It's like, that was the greenie car 20 years ago. It's like, well, that's a hippie car. I'm never buying that stupid thing. Now the psychology around it is, well, it's not about the hybrid isn't hippie as much as it's like, as John was pointing out, I want my miles per gallon to be better than 10. Yeah. So if I can still fill up with gas every day and get 22, okay. And if that's called a hybrid, fine, man. Like, I'm game. The hippie car is the one that's got the plug that runs on electricity. Yes. But my hybrid, whatever it is, it runs on gas. That's not a weird thing now. So that took a fifth of a quarter of a century for that to kind of, rotate through. So to your point, Loren, it's like, how much longer is that going to take for plugins and pure electrics to get to where we're at? Well, if we start doing the math and also that longevity of gas cars on the road, we are decades away. And I say to people all the time when they say, we got to get the gas model of how you get gas out of people's minds. We have to kill it immediately. I'm like, you won't. Yeah. Like, that is a generational change. We will in 20, 30 years, we will have plenty of people who will that own homes that will say, oh yeah, I just fill up at home 99% of the time. I don't care. I don't think about it. It doesn't bother me at all. And it's cheap. Like, that will be a thing that is much more mainstream understood, but the experiential piece has to happen. And all these factors we're talking about are going to have to live themselves out. And it's the human element is the thing that no matter how much we talk about this, how are humans responding to it? And so often that gets overlooked because, as we talked about, and as John pointed out earlier, about that hype cycle of just get the product in market, just get it in there. It's like, is it truly ready for people to use yet? No, it's going to take time. So
Yeah, Loren, I completely agree with what you said. The focus has got to be on carbon reduction. Who cares how you get there? Who cares? And in fact, I'm dreaming now, right? I would have much preferred the government or the EPA to go to each one of these car companies and say, General Motors, you got to reduce your carbon footprint by X number of tons this year.
Right.
And here's what every year is going. You figure it out, and we're going to have some sort of mechanism to verify, trust but verify. But, let's focus on carbon reduction, not on specific technology that we want you to use.
Yeah. And the answer is still probably going to be electric vehicles, right?
Yeah, right.
But
I mean, wasn't that what the EPA was doing with their kind of mandates for the
for fleet miles per gallon? Like your fleet has to,
I mean, that's kind of what they were doing.
We're slowly walking into the carbon credit type thing of like, how did Tesla make money for a decade and what were they doing? I mean, so do we put the backs yet again on other companies that are willing to make a pure electric fleet and these other companies just buy their credits from somewhere else? I mean, now we're getting to the deep politics of it. And the truth is we need genuine vision and leadership from companies on product development. And so that's where I really look at what we're doing to basically shield Americans from products that are being, advanced and designed well outside of the United States. And the American public is just not really being exposed to what they should be thinking of as options. And we're shielding our domestic manufacturers from having to compete. And so it doesn't really help us in that way either. So yeah, everything we're discussing right now is a very interesting and crazy web of what's the tipping point that actually gets people to say they want it and the industry domestically to say we'll do it. And then how do the politics align with all of that? So I don't know. Do we have another hour?
I was going to say, since we just solved that, obviously, let's go over to the state of EV charging. But I guess, no, one thing I'll just say is I think everything you guys said was pretty accurate, but there's nothing. I think one of the advantages to why I think EVs will overall take off faster than hybrids did is hybrids just are not fun to drive. And as like for an average American or anyone that's like, you're not going to buy a car like, oh, if I buy this car, I'd buy a car if it saves me money. I'm not going to buy a car probably because there's a carbon reduction. But if it drives faster, it's more fun, and it's better for the environment, okay, now I'm kind of interested. And so,
yeah, but if you can save several $100s a month on gas, because if you're driving like a big Ram pickup that gets 15 miles per gallon, and you can get it up to, as Matt said, to 22 or something, right? That
it matters. But to Chase's point, this gets back to what we were talking about earlier, like even the aesthetic of like, man, Tesla's got to update their fleet because it's aging. It's like what triggers people to say yes to wanting to buy the product they're buying. And some of these factors that make sense, well, that's fine. That's logical. But as we've discussed multiple times as a group, who buys cars based on logic? Not a lot of people.
Right. So. But I think there's just something to be said. Like, obviously, if you live in Wyoming and you got your Ram pickup, props to you. I don't think they're listening to this podcast. But I will say it's just like we have a Land Rover, great off-roading vehicle. It gets like 10 miles to the gallon. But at the same time, it's older than I am. So it's been around for almost 40 years. And so it's like we're keeping on the road. We probably put like 5,000 miles a year on it. And then we put 26,000 miles a year on our Tesla. And that's kind of the thing where it's just like, I think there's more of an argument to be made to make the city driving a lot of the day-to-day driving, just your EV. And then if you want to have a combustion, like, I don't know. I disagree with, I think there's interest in that. But I think for a lot of families, especially on multiple vehicles, it's just like, I think you can have a much larger indent in the carbon reduction side of it if you have and I think we're starting to see this, but there's still challenges with the actual fueling thing, that whole part of it, of actually just making your daily and doing so many more miles on a fully electric. And then when you want to do something or go off in the mountain or go tow something, you got your big old pickup.
Are you making the case for plug-in hybrids?
I was about to say it. As some product designer at OEM is like, that sounds like.
No. Because I don't want a plug-in hybrid.
Because you just did, and I'm a big fan of plug-in hybrids because they allow you to do with one car what you just described to do with two cars.
Yeah. No, not
anyway,
for me.
Let's move on to
I realize I'm kind of in the minutia though. But yeah, I'll drive like 200 miles in a day in an EV and it's fine. I don't want to deal with oil changes and all that crap in a plug-in hybrid. But this is my own opinions on that. And like you said, we've already been talking about this for an hour. So let's get to real quickly the state of EV charging, which I think is something we probably agree more on. And Loren, I'm curious on your thoughts of just what you've been seeing in the space and probably a lot of the conversations you've been having as far as NEVI and actual kind of the current state of charging infrastructure rollout.
Yeah, so I'll sort of speak to it from like the industry perspective, kind of the B2B perspective. And, I'm calling it, we're moving from charging 1.0 to charging 2.0, right? Like if you think about the last 10 years, and I'm not going to mention any names because I work with all of them as customers or prospects or whatever it is, but, there's some charging companies that basically were in the let's sell chargers to unsuspecting restaurant owners and stuff. And those chargers go out back behind the building where there's no lighting near the garbage cans. And, 3 years later, those chargers have cobwebs on them. The software hasn't been updated. Matt knows what I'm speaking about. And people just getting incentives and grants to like get these things in the ground. It was a land grab, right?
Yeah.
Now, in the last 18 months, we're moving into BP Pulse, Circle K, 7-Eleven, Pilot, Love's, Mercedes-Benz, GM, Quick Stop, Quick Trip. You go down the list. We're moving from companies that were crossing their fingers that they could sell a lot of chargers, and then EV sales would go up and utilization would go up, and at some point they would actually make a profit, to moving into companies that are like multi-billion-dollar companies that already have physical footprints and stores and profits. And adding chargers is a business that they understand because most of them are in the fueling business, right? As Matt, often refers to it, we're talking about refueling here, right? Whether it's gas or electric. And so they're adding a different kind of pump, and they understand that business. And they don't want to lose money on the charging business, but what they're really excited about is getting people out of the car once they plug it in and inside the store. I mean, I posted something the other day on Buc-ee's. Buc-ee's is announcing a new store in Ohio. It's going to have 100 gas pumps and 24 fast chargers. And I've never been to a Buc-ee's, but I'm told they're like twice the size of a Target store or something like that. They're massive.
Small city.
Yeah. And so the second part of it, Chase, is that, the first part is we're moving to a different kind of company and what their goal and reason for getting into the charging business is. The second part of it is they already are in the retail business, so they're looking for incremental revenue. So this whole thing about how do we get people inside the store is sort of like the next part of this. And so we have this dichotomy. I wrote about this in my newsletter the other day of, there's all these people, the Ram drivers who don't want to be EV and say, I am never going to buy an EV until it can charge in 5 minutes, just like I can at the gas station. But guess what? All the companies that are now getting into the charging business want you to stay parked for 20 to 45 minutes and go inside the store and get the Buc-ee's barbecue and the Buc-ee's beaver hat and a lotto ticket and hang out and have a nice time and spend, $37.52 inside the store and, $12 out there for charging, right? So this is what I see as fascinating, that we're moving into like a whole new different paradigm of companies and why they're in the charging business. And then you add in like Mercedes and Iona, and they're like, well, we're doing this because we want to sell more EVs, right? And we finally realized that that's what we have to do. We can't just rely on, unnamed charging networks, right? But and the last thing I will say that's part of the sort of this charging 2.0 is that the dream of high utilization is actually happening now. Like several of the major charging networks now have 20, 25, almost 30% utilization on average. A couple of years ago it was 4%.
Yeah.
Like 2 or 3 years ago, Electrify America averaged 4% utilization. They're now at, by my numbers that I get from a third-party source, 27%. right? I visited the Electrify America 20 stall center here in San Francisco. That's an indoor mall. They have 2 lounges in there. We were there at 10:30 in the morning, and there's just cars like lined up, right? And there was times where there were a couple of stalls open, but they said that in the middle of the night, rideshare drivers come in by the droves. So that station is probably at north of 50% utilization, right? So what does that get us to? They're actually starting to make money, right? You can actually now make money in the charging business, and we're seeing, Electrify America actually now is testing pricing strategies and limiting people to charge to only 85%. Because they're trying to get rid of the lines, right? And I know Matt could talk about that. Not a good idea for like an hour, but at any rate, there's just sort of like some of the key components we're seeing in sort of like this next version of the charging industry. It's fundamentally going into the next phase.
I guess, Mike, it's really interesting you talk about all that, because I had a conversation pretty similar to those lines yesterday. And I'm not terribly convinced that there's a strong business case for like an Electrify America where it's just what you do, unless they pivot and become like the next generation of like a Pilot or Flying J as well. And that's, I think, a bigger business transition than the Pilot and Flying J's of the world, or the Buckies adding charging stops and kind of getting that additional revenue from the actual sales, which to me makes a lot more sense than trying to make, because we're starting to see like the per kilowatt hour rate of some of these EV chargers go up to such a point that it's just as, if not more expensive than buying gas. And then you're just kind of running into like a worse situation overall. Whereas like when I road trip with my wife and our dogs, the car is usually ready before they are.
Right.
And then you're kind of looking at also, the kind of what is available to you at that place that you stop. And that's where kind of something like a Buc-ee's, where it's food or whatever, is such a big benefit than behind, like you're talking about, some of these early old ones that would just be in kind of random places behind old kind of sketchy parking lots and stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's to your point about the amenities, like that's why the majority of the award winners from the states in the NEVI program are the convenience store chains and the travel centers, because those people at the state DOTs, at the end of the day, they want their legacy to be, this money that we handed out from our federal tax dollars to these companies, it's actually a really good charging experience, right? Like they don't care about the hardware and the chargers and all that kind of stuff. They want to make sure that it's a good, safe experience.
Well, and that right there, I think, hits the nail on the head for what is a positive direction for NEVI dollars and where things are going for the future, as you call it, the 2.0 process. Is it's about the driver experience. Finally, I mean, not just like to your point, like, well, let's put something out there and hope to God someone finds it, and I think that
if we build it, they will come kind of mentality.
And I just always was you just shake your head at it. It's just like, now you're not thinking about how people operate, how humans operate. And I think that there's a lot of positive points that are coming out of where these deployments are going to happen and how we'll improve upon the actual driver experience. Years ago, when people used to say, like, we should just install charging stations at gas stations, my response was always, not until the technology actually can make it worth being at a gas station for a reasonable amount of time, as opposed to 2 hours, for example. Where now it's like 15, 20, 30 minutes. It's like, okay, that balances out more. And if you have something like a Buc-ee's, I mean, people that buy gas at a Buc-ee's, they're not timing themselves when they're there, but chances are they're there for a lot longer than it took me 5 minutes. It's like, but you were there for a while.
Yeah, hey, Matt, there's been some studies on that where people traveling on the interstates, their average stop is about 27 minutes.
There you go.
And, if you're traveling with children too, and they all got to go to the bathroom every couple of hours, you're going to be stopping again anyway. So charge to 80%, even make it faster.
Yeah. To that point, John, I posted something the other day about this, and a guy said he did a road trip in a Tesla where he never stopped for more than, I think he said 10 minutes, because what he would do is he would get to about 20% and charge to 50%. So he would do these, and experienced road trippers and EVs know that. Like, no, you don't charge to like 100%. You charge in that curve. And so you stop maybe one or two extra times, but your total accumulated time on the trip is actually less because you're maximizing the charging curve. Now, Matt could counter for an hour about while that's going to take a while to get like the next generation of EV buyers to understand and want to do that. But
if we present it in a way that I think actually, if we communicate it in a way that they understand it in a way that doesn't sound like a deficiency.
Kids need to go to the bathroom every 2 hours.
Not even that. I just, again, like the whole 85% thing from Electrify America, for example. I mean, I put up something on LinkedIn and I just said, I said, this is not going to translate well. And because why? People, when they're filling up their car, if all of a sudden you're told, hey, at this particular station and pump, you can only get 85% of your tank, they're going to go, why? That seems crazy. Like, they don't understand the chemistry and the engineering of why. They just want what they want. So I think there's better ways to communicate to the public how the technology will work for them that still appeases a mindset of I'm getting everything I want. Everything from like, again, saying that 80% of the battery is 100% on paper and then calling the 81% to 100% bonus battery that you can use for road tripping that only can slow charge. I mean, we can then identify different metrics around like how does the battery function, but still arguably saying to people, you're still getting what you think it is, which is full. I mean, the idea of saying, we just need you to make a concession as a consumer to only get 80 to 85%. I'm sorry, this is America. And that's last time I checked, someone doesn't go to a ball game and say, hey, can you give me that beer, but only fill it up 3/4 and then have the rest foam and watch me go like this? It's like, yeah, give me a break. This is just not how you communicate product to the public.
So what do you think about using capitalism, Matt? And sure, you can fill up to 100%, but the 80% to 100% is going to be
expensive.
$4 a kilowatt hour.
Well, then you'll have the people that are willing to justify
do that.
Yeah. Then you still run the risk of someone who's just going to sit there and go, meh, and still piss people off because they're charging to 100%. I think it's, I mean, again, most people that, again, to Chase's point, who's listening to our conversation, I think the vast majority of the general public is
hundreds of thousands of people. There's lots of people listening. Millions.
That is the point.
Yeah.
But I mean, the general public, I think if you tell them they're getting what they expect, which is, I want to fill up. If you just tell them, yeah, you can fill up. The concession the automakers then have to make is we can't maximize our EPA rated range out of the entire battery pack and say it gets 312 miles of range. In fact, it's the 100% daily usage is 270 miles of range. But for road tripping, you can make it 312 with this bonus battery. To me, that's how you communicate the technology in a way that helps them understand, well, oh, you're right. I don't need 312 miles of range every day. But if I do road trip 5 times a year, I can use that bonus battery. Okay, that's a benefit. Okay, cool. I think that's a better strategy for communicating as opposed to saying, hey, public, please make a concession on trying to learn all this engineering. I think it's a completely ridiculous way of going about it.
Yeah. So. Matt, why don't you think the automakers have used like a reserve concept like you have in your gas card, and you get down to E, it's like, okay, you've got to go to a gas station, but you've got like a gallon or 2 gallons left below E. Why don't you think they've done that with?
I think it depends on the automaker.
Well, it does depend on the automaker.
Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, like Volkswagen and Audi kind of played with some of that a little bit, I think, but for how they can open up battery down the line kind of thing. But I think the bigger reason is they were looking at what do people care about most? Range anxiety.
Right.
Yeah. So they go, forget it. We're just, how far can this energy density of this and efficiency of this battery pack get you from 100 to 0? Let's throw them that number because that makes them feel better. That's a misunderstanding of what people were concerned about in the first place, which was access to fuel, not how far can this thing go. So, that's
It's kind of interesting you mentioned that because Loren, exactly that guy that commented that they kind of roll in. I mean, the longest road trip I've done kind of regularly is from Bend, Oregon to Phoenix, Arizona, which is about 1,200 miles. And I've done that in a day, I think 6 times, twice in a combustion and then mostly in an EV. And when I'm doing that, I'm like rolling in at a few percent, charging it for like 10, 15 minutes using the bathroom, whatever, and then getting on the road for another 2 hours. It does take me longer than when I did it in my Subaru, but I do notice, like, every time I've done it, I am definitely more alert by the time I'm rolling in either to Bend or Phoenix, just because I kind of have been able to kind of get up and kind of mentally reboot a little bit. And it's not that big of a time difference. But once again, the majority of people aren't crazy like me, and they drive with like other people. And when they've done that, like I said with my wife, you're usually at these places longer. And so that delta isn't as big of a thing. But to kind of what you're talking about, Matt, also, like, some of the EVs, like with the Tesla, you can pretty much take that thing down to 0% and even go a little beyond it. But then like Polestar and a few others, once you get to like 5 or even under 10%, you get all sorts of lights going off. You have to like charge it on all this, and it's a much different and kind of a much scarier EV driving experience. Whereas I know with like my Tesla, I can just get it down to a few percent regularly, and I don't even notice I can still like floor it, and it still has plenty of power.
Well, that's confidence in the product ecosystem that the science
For sure.
to the public, right? You know,
but I think that conversation, it's good to have that, but I think very few people do that in even a combustion vehicle. And I think very few people even do the road trip. I think just so many people in the US just fly now that I'm always surprised. Like, I almost kind of do it for fun. Just like, you know what, I can, given the industry I work in and stuff, I can do this road trip, kind of document it, and there's some interesting things along the way anyways. But I think so many of these people, and this could be probably not a good argument for carbon reduction, but I think most people after like a 4-hour, like if it's going to be a 4 or 5 hour drive and there's a flight option, they're probably going to take the flight option. And in some ways, that's where
this is why we need high-speed rail in North America. So.
Yes.
That's
another future show.
I was going to say, if getting people to drive EVs is a pipe dream, I think that is just like a pipe delusion. I don't get me wrong, I would love to see that, but that is a unfortunate, unlikely outcome. I've got a feeling you want to say something there, though, Loren.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, on your, and I joke about this often, right? I think there are probably two main types of road trippers, right? There's that single driver who's saying, I can get from San Francisco to LA in 5 hours and 20 minutes. And I'm, you know, going to have a bottle in the car to pee, right? I'm not even going to stop, right? And then there are people,
haven't gone there yet.
which my dad had a bottle in the car when I was a kid, so I know that concept exists, right? But and my oldest daughter would do that when she was in school and college in Southern California. She would only stop to like get gas, and she would not do anything else. But when we as a family go on a road trip, I look at road trips completely differently in an EV now than I do in a gas car. I look at it as enjoying life more and enjoying like the boring trip down Interstate 5 and turning it into, I'm going to stop off and have a nice relaxing breakfast or lunch, or stop off at Harris Ranch and get a nice dead cow, you know, grilled to perfection, right? But, you know, to me, I turn it into an advantage of, you know, if we're going to stop and charge, I want to enjoy life and have a nice breakfast or lunch or whatever it is. That's not for everybody, though, right? That's not for everybody.
You know, Loren, what you're describing is how motorists were 120 years ago.
Right.
You know, you had to plan ahead. You had to think ahead. You know, going on a motor trip was, you know, it was an adventure. You know, we've made automobiles so convenient, so easy. You know, it's just fill it and go and whatnot. And you're getting back more to the roots of what automobilism, as they used to call it back then, was all about.
Yeah, and part of it may be, you know, my if I had gray hair, I would say gray hair, but is, you know, it's just like you get a certain point in your life and it's about smelling the roses, right? And so to me, it's like if I'm going to go on that 500-mile road trip, you know, that's really boring down Interstate 5, I want to enjoy it. So stop off at the outlet mall, stop off and have a nice breakfast, like whatever it is.
The counter to that is the person who says, if I know it's going to be boring, I want it to go as fast as possible, which means I don't want to stop.
And that's what I said. It's not for everybody. And that's why I tell those people to get a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid, right? Like, you know.
No, I mean, I think if you're doing that regularly, that's for sure one thing. I mean, I'm kind of curious of
Or
everyone on here.
take
What's the
train, take
longest,
the high
like,
speed train.
right? What's the longest road trip any of you guys have done in like the past year or two?
I did Portland to Chicago back through North Dakota in my Model 3.
Okay, yeah, maybe that's pretty good.
Yeah. So, and that was one of those ones where just kind of like, I know I can do it because
Right.
I've, but I just, why not, and I could have flown, but I did drive that trip to make a point because when I got to Chicago, I was presenting to the executives from the auto dealers from around the country. And I made a point to say, look, what I just did is what you are about to need to explain to every single person that walks in your store when you have an EV on your lot. That's what you need to understand. And so I did it as an exercise. But to Loren's point, the experience, the drive of it for what it was, I did enjoy the idea of stopping and seeing what was around me when I had to stop and charge, but I also wasn't stopping and charging for 40 minutes or whatever. I was leapfrogging, like you described, Chase. So again, all these things are learned elements of what we've had to learn about, and exactly what John said. It's like, yeah, you're rewinding 120 years, and it said whatever you had. Okay, which hardware store or pharmacy has gasoline added on this rudimentary map, and so it's full circle in this experiential thing of how we're evolving. It all comes back to confidence and trust of where you can get your fill up so you can continue your journey, right? And then what is your comfort around that, and while you're doing it, what is around you while you are doing that? So it's amazing how it's kind of come full circle for it. Just is an evolution of what did you say was automobilization? Automobilism. Yeah, no, it's just a new chapter in that. But it's the human element, the human factor that's involved in that is what creates these discussions, and then in turn how we translate that as a value proposition to the public. I mean, I don't know. I'm excited to see if we can get the conversation from here out to more people in the industry as stakeholders and say we need to be talking about this all in this comprehensive fashion more often because we're not yet.
So I think part of it, Matt, is sort of connecting the dots with all of this is like, when people see these announcements from Buc-ee's and stuff, like LinkedIn just like explodes with excitement, right? Oh my God, that's amazing, right? And so you think about, Pilot and Circle K and Loves and all these sort of destinations. And then now you add in the Starbucks with the Mercedes deal and things like that. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I usually choose, which superchargers to charge at based on what food options are closest to that supercharger.
Now that that's true, there are options, because for a long time as a Tesla owner, I have to use that supercharger. And so you got really used to whatever restaurant that was. But now you can now have variances in your road tripping because of how many there are.
State 5, there's like 9 superchargers, right? And so literally, I could choose to skip 2 to go to the third one because they had a nicer restaurant option or whatever.
Pea Soup Anderson's or whatever it might be.
The other importance of what you're talking about there is this is normalizing EVs and the EV charging experience, because people, I hear this all the time. I wouldn't know where to go charge. And I said, well, of course you don't, because you don't own an EV. You don't see these things. They're not well marked and whatnot. But as they go to rest stops and these different chains have got fast chargers, and they see them and they see that electric cars are being charged and they're all different kinds of electric vehicles, that's going to get them thinking, you know what, maybe it's time for me to start looking at one.
Well, and I think to that point, it's the complete lack of visibility into there's gas as an option to fill up and there's electricity as an option to fill up. And that electricity is an option to fill up. There's still 100% lack of visibility. There is no marketing, no communication around it. The day I watch Sunday Night Football and there's an advertisement about electric fuel, I'll go, okay, cool. We're finally having a serious conversation about how we can get people to understand this better. Until that happens, I know that we're not getting it right. So,
John, there was a fascinating study done by UC Davis Transportation Studies Department earlier this year that looked at, kind of what you and Matt are talking about, which is recognition of chargers being available. And what they found, which makes a lot of sense, is that people that owned EVs or were in consideration mode of an EV
we're looking
noticed EV charging stations when they were driving around town or wherever they were. People that were not interested in EVs didn't even see them or the lack of them.
Yep.
In other words, it's that old sort of obvious idea, when you see a pink Porsche, then all of a sudden you see like 100 pink Porsches. It's like, if you're not looking for charging stations, right, you don't see them even if they're there. And so it's this sort of like catch-22 thing.
And this is where the industry got it wrong, thinking like, well, then we just got to build more of them. We got to build 1 trillion of these damn things. And my response, UC Davis did a study around this about 5 years ago now, maybe more, where they asked those, those who were in the market, is there enough public charging out there for you to trust an EV? And X% said yes or no. Then 3 years later, they did the study again. The amount of charging stations in California had doubled. This is all done in California. They asked the same question again, are there enough charging stations? And the amount of people that said no doubled. And so it's like, okay, that's a great data point. That tells you, don't just carpet bomb the world with these things. Exactly how you said it, Loren. It is about visibility. And if you're actively looking for it, you will go, oh my God, there's a level 2 right there in front of Lowe's. Wow, that's great. But most people, to your point, will just walk right by it because they're not thinking about it actively. Right. This is where somewhere Don Draper is like, hi, have you heard of advertising? We can help change the conversation. So yeah.
Well, I think the secondary thing that's really interesting too is like the infotainment in a combustion vehicle. When you say you're going to go somewhere, it just shows you like, oh yeah, you're driving 800 miles. You're just going to do straight that. Like it just automatically assumes you're never going to stop, and you figure out along the way where to refuel, where to stop. Sure. Whereas I think one of the other kind of underrated things for like Tesla and Rivian to an extent is they just have a really good trip planner built into their infotainment. So it does like a lot of this heavy lifting for you. And so you don't even have to find it. And I think that's just inherently one of the big challenges is like for a new technology to take off, it doesn't have to be just as good, it has to be better. And I think part of that is obviously the fueling experience, but the simplicity of just like, okay, I'm going to get to, I don't know, Grand Rapids. I'm just throwing out some random city. And I know exactly where I'm going to stop on those places. And I was like, okay, if I want to be here for 30 minutes or whatever, I'll just get lunch there. Well,
this is what we're describing is so that subconscious trust of course, gas is between me and 800 miles away.
Right, exactly.
It's because it's highly advertised and highly visible. And we've had it for a century. And the Tesla's approach was, again, the McDonald's of charging. It was like, okay, on this map, we'll show you where these dots are. And when you pull up to each one, it's going to look exactly the same every time. And when you plug it in, it's going to work the same every time. And it's going to be about the same amount of time every time. That's the beauty of what they designed. And that's what the lack of understanding from the legacies was. They said, we'll just get these data points, throw them in a map, and yeah, you'll figure it out. But we'll call it ours because PR is rad. Yeah. And then people that experienced it went, oh, wow, this is not the same looking station as the last one. Then the shape of it's different. And I guess it's from this now. I mean, that's the lack of appreciation for what we were asking people to do. And to your point, Tesla knocked it out of the park. Rivian has a bunch of Tesla alums that understand how to fix it. I think it's very interesting that Rivian has basically said, like, CarPlay, same way Tesla said, we're not doing it. And I think that's, if you can get software right, that is the right approach. CarPlay, Android Auto, they are what people have gotten accustomed to in legacy vehicles because you just mirror it and gosh, my phone's in my dashboard. But man, you can create a better experience if you actually get the software right. And that's the part that I think we're still at the beginning stages of how most automakers are going to understand how to approach that. And to John's point earlier, they can spend billions and still get it wrong. And then they might end up just saying, okay, who got it right? We'll wave the white flag and we'll just use what you got. I think that is we'll see more of that too. So.
Hey, John, I realize we've already gone over time pretty decently, but I'm kind of curious. You probably test drive vehicles the most out of any of us. And is your daily, is it an electric vehicle?
This week it is. I've been driving a Honda Prologue this week. I had an ID4 the week before that, last week. And I mean, I love getting into electrics and trying to evaluate, who's doing a good job and who's not.
When you're test driving these, like, how do you ever kind of purposely take them on road trips, or like, what's the farthest you've ever gone in an EV? When you're
they don't want us taking road trips in these vehicles unless you get permission from them. They have these vehicles that they put in the fleet. They want all the media to drive it, and then once it hits a certain mileage, they pull it inside and sell it. So no, I have not taken an EV on a long trip.
Well, there's an app for that called Chargeway. You can just download it. It'll tell you exactly where you got to stop, John. I'm just pointing that out. I mean, just anecdotally.
That's right. No, they usually they want you to not go more than 500 miles in a week. And, now you can call the automaker and say, hey, look, I want to take a road trip in this. And 9 times out of 10, they'll say, yeah, go ahead and do that. But I have not gone on a long trip with an electric.
Well, you're dedicating time differently than you normally would for what you're evaluating. For sure. Right?
Correct. So, that's right.
Yeah.
Chase, I want to, since we're talking road trips and you brought up NEVI at the beginning when you asked me, which I didn't really address. The one thing that the public still, and even much of the industry still doesn't understand, is the NEVI corridor program, the part of the $5 billion that will be spent on building out the 4 150 kW chargers every 50 miles. By my estimate, that's only going to add up to 7,000 to 8,000 ports, right? And so this Biden goal, we hear of 500,000 all the time. The NEVI corridor program's intent and purpose and what it's going to do is add actually very few chargers. Like, that's not its intent, is to put them there where nobody else is going to put them, out in the middle of rural North Dakota. So somebody can go from, and I don't know my geography, but from, let's say, Idaho to, Wisconsin or whatever, and go through North Dakota and know that there's plenty of fast charge. They can actually make that trip, right? Yeah. That's its point, is to give people confidence that they can take that trip to Yellowstone that they've been saying they're going to do for 10 years and never do it. But they actually know they can do it if they buy an EV. And so it's fundamentally, its purpose is to help give people confidence to buy an EV, so they can go on the road trip that they've planned for years and, fill in those charging deserts.
You'd mentioned before, Loren, with the NEVI funding, that it kind of had the unintentional effect of maybe slowing down some of the rollouts of DC fast charging. Are you still seeing that, or is it kind of, it does seem like there a lot more charging sites are going in, whether they get NEVI or not. They might apply for it or try to get some. But I just remember with the original kind of rollout, we were seeing kind of a slowdown unintentionally because of it.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One is when the NEVI announcement first came out and the program was going, I had a lot of customers who were like, woohoo, right? We're going to get some of that free money, 80%, blah, blah, blah. And then when the states started rolling out their RFPs, and they were like, oh, this is really difficult and complex, and it takes time, and we may not win. There's competition, right? And there's companies that know how to file grants and incentive applications. They've been doing it for 10 years, right? And then a lot of them said, oh, okay, we're going to move to plan B, which is, we actually already have plans to add 1,000 charging stations over the next 5 years. And so we're taking a NEVI is nice, not necessary. Right. And so I've sort of seen a lot. I mean, there's certainly some companies that are all in on NEVI, but a lot of them are I'm not going to mention their names because they're pretty much all customers of mine. But, you look at some of these major charging networks that have these big plans, and they're like, we have to hit these numbers. And if we get NEVI funding, great. But if we don't, we still have to open them. Right.
Right.
The second piece of it, and I just posted some numbers about this on LinkedIn the other day, and the numbers are still, I don't have a lot of confidence in them, but there are 15 sites that have been NEVI funded that are now open. And I looked at the award announcement date and the open date. It's the average was about 7 months.
I was going to guess 9, but okay.
Yeah. So it ranged from 60 days to almost a year, 357, I think it was, for a pilot site. And the 60 days was a New York site that was funded actually under a state program. And then they called it NEVI. And speaking of New York, they have a rule of thumb that it takes 16 months from contract signing with the vendor to a site, fast charging site going live, right? So far, it actually looks like this is not slowing down. But the reality is, I think a lot of what has happened is these states all require the applicant to have pre-negotiated with utilities, that utility can pull the power. They've got transformers, they've got all that stuff. So by the time they get the award, it's like they've got the construction crew like sitting there, like ready to trench, and literally they can actually get the site done in like 2 or 3 weeks. Install the hardware, drop it in, like EVgo and Tesla do this now. They literally bring in the prefab, right? They just drop it in, and then it's just, can the utility connect it up to the grid, and do they have the switch gear and transformers? And so that's actually the side benefit, is that you will not win an award if you don't have an agreement with the utility that they can supply your site within a reasonable time frame, the power, the equipment, and stuff like that. So it's still early, but it seems like that once you get the award and the contract signed, things go like really quickly.
That's good. How many states have still not done NEVI at all?
14 states have. New Jersey just opened theirs a couple of days ago, so we went from the sort of frigid 15 down to 14. I have to come up with my name for the 14 now, but so there's
more frigid 14 or something.
But so but there's about 5 or 6 states now that are on like phase 3. Right. So while we have 14 states that still haven't even opened round 1 of RFP, there's several that are in round 2 and round 3. Right. So it's a real, like all things in life, right? It's a mix. Some people are like way ahead, and some people, I think, are waiting for the election, and then they're going to say, oh, yeah, we're not doing this.
Yeah, Florida was already trying to reallocate NEVI dollars in other ways and things like that.
Yeah. Don't get me started about Florida. Yeah.
Well, I think on that note, we've crossed the 90-minute mark, and we're trying to keep it under 2 hours. So to make sure no one else talks about anything, I think that's probably where we're going to call it for today. But I just want to say thank you to all 3 of you. This was always a great time. And so looking forward to the next conversation. But thank you, everyone, for listening. And with that, we'll have to do this again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Chase.
Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Grid Connections podcast. We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the world of electric vehicles with our fantastic panel of guests, John McElroy from Autoline Network, Matt Teske of Chargeway, and Loren McDonald of EV Adoption. Remember to check the show notes in today's episode to learn more about each of our guests and learn more about what they are working on in today's automotive industry. We covered a lot of ground today, from the latest trends in EV sales and the challenges facing the broader automotive industry, our discussion on the advantages of plug-in hybrids versus fully electric vehicles, along with the current status of EV charging and road trips, providing valuable insights for all EV enthusiasts. And of course, we explore the progress of NEVI funding and its potential impact on EV infrastructure across the U.S. If you found this episode insightful, please share it with at least one other person who might enjoy it too. Your support helps us reach more listeners and spread the word about the exciting developments in the EV world. Don't forget to leave a positive review on our podcast page. Your feedback is invaluable to us. And until next week, this is the Grid Connections podcast, signing off.